I wanted to welcome everyone. I'm Cynthia Gordon. I'm the co-vice president for advocacy for NCJW Greater Long Beach and West Orange County. And I'm really happy to welcome all of you to our program tonight on domestic violence. NCJW, as many of you know, is the leading progressive organization whose members strive to improve the lives of women, children, and families through advocacy, education, service, and philanthropy. We work every single day to advance policies and efforts on issues such as reproductive health, voting rights, racial and immigrant justice, homelessness and poverty, and family-friendly and equitable workplaces. We also collaborate with like-minded local and state organizations to serve our community. National Council has been around for 125 years, and our section here is celebrating our 75th anniversary. We welcome women and men of all faiths while we are guided by the Jewish value of tikkun olam, to heal the world. So tonight we will hear from 4 experts on a subject that too often is shrouded in secrecy. We will learn how to recognize domestic violence, signs of abuse to watch out for, and how we as individuals in our community can help an affected family member or friend. In addition, a domestic violence survivor will share her story and how she's now helping others who need help leaving domestic violence situations. This program is especially timely due to the striking rise of abuse during the pandemic over the last year and a half, when victims have been isolated, families may have lost income and or housing, and community services have been severely impacted. So, a few housekeeping items before we get started. Please stay on mute for this evening's discussion. We will not be taking oral questions, but we will take questions through the chat. If you have a question for one of our speakers, please send me a direct chat message. And when all the speakers have finished, we'll address the questions. I encourage all of you to remain in speaker view so that you can best see our speakers during the program. Closed captioning is also available to you if you want. You should be able to turn it on by clicking on the CC button at the bottom of your main Zoom window. I also wanted to note that we are recording this discussion and posting it to our website and to our YouTube channel, so you'll be able to go back and view it again and also refer it to family and friends. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce Sherry Sobel, who is an NCJW board member and member of our advocacy committee. Sherry will introduce our speakers and moderate the discussion this evening. Sherry.
Hello, everybody. Absolutely thrilled to have you all here. Oh my God, my head is so big. I had to move forward so you can hear me. So yesterday in the LA Times, it's backwards for you now, on the front page of the LA Times, it said the following. In France, a woman is killed by a partner or an ex every 3 days. And it went on to discuss what's happening with domestic violence in France. This is a worldwide issue, and the pandemic did not help. Let me introduce our 4 fabulous speakers. I'm going to do it all at once because I'm not big on bios. Let's let the people who know what to say it. Okay. Judge Jacqueline Lewis. We were sworn in on the same day. We started working on the same day. She's a bestie and I love her. When Jackie decided to run for an open judicial seat, she was called by the bar and the LA Times exceptionally well qualified. I never saw that before her. I never saw that since her. So she knows what she's talking about. Let's see. She runs the domestic violence court in West Covina. Her primary assignment was in juvie with me, juvenile court, centering around child abuse and neglect. Her interest in domestic violence began in a law school internship program where she assisted in the preparation of applications for restraining orders and represented battered persons in restraining order hearings. She's done a lot of teaching on this issue. Judge Lewis was the primary author editor of the LA County Dependency Court Domestic Violence Guidelines, which became the basis of the AOC, that's the Administrative Office of the Court, that's the state of California, Domestic Violence Independency Cases, a Judge's Guide. Every judge in the state of California has the book she wrote. She'll be talking to us in a simple manner, in a simply kind of what the law is, just to give you a basis. Deidre King is the Community-Based Services Coordinator at Jewish Family and Children's Service in Long Beach. She holds a graduate degree in social work from Simmons University in Boston, Massachusetts. She is a key part of both the domestic violence program as well as the school-based program. As a member of the domestic violence team, she currently oversees the intake process for new members interested in the court-approved group Healthy Relationships, Healthy Kids. Yay, Deidre, this sounds great. The group offers support and education to women impacted by domestic violence. She also provides compassionate support and guidance to families that are navigating challenging times. And she is going to talk to us about the psychological issues, the cycle of violence. Ellen Goldsmith is a licensed clinical social worker in private practice in Long Beach. She was director of the DV Project, Jewish Family and Children's Services, from 2001 to 2008. She will present on domestic violence in the Jewish community, bringing it right back to our community. This was the basis of her very, very well-known thesis. This is an important issue in the Jewish community. Julie Schwartz is the executive director of Project Woman Good, sorry, Jewel, a nonprofit she founded in 2020. She helps those in DV situations get out and stay out. They provide individual advocacy, counseling, one-on-one, and guidance through the court system and paperwork. She left an abusive relationship in 2016 with little money and 2 young daughters. She will share with us her personal story. And finishing up, last but not least, we'll have Julie bringing it all together and down to the personal. I'm absolutely thrilled to introduce these 4 wonderful women. Jack, take it away.
Hello, everybody. I really am happy to be here. And Sherry, thank you for the nice introduction. I don't know that I'm the expert, but I can tell you I've been interested in this for the last 30-some years and have a lot of experience, sort of unfortunately, in doing it. So tonight what they've asked me to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about the legal definition of domestic violence and abuse, so you know what it is we're required to look for in the court. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about what this looks like in real life. And I may kind of cross over with you, Deirdre, in talking about that. Because it's the things that we see, what domestic violence, the things that happen in real life and how that comes into our courthouse. We're going to talk a little bit about lethality indicators when it comes to how deadly domestic violence can be and what to look for. And then back to the law with talking about the different kinds of restraining orders, how you get one, what the court has to look for. And I go through that in part because I know that some of you are being advocates for other people, and you'll kind of be able to see how to help people by looking at what the court needs to look for, what the parties might look like when they come in front of us and how that can make a difference, and then talk a little bit about support people and their ability to come into the courts and support the people that they're there to. So we're going to start with the definition of abuse legally, and I know this gets kind of dry, but for the purposes of the family law court, abuse means any of the following: to intentionally or recklessly cause or attempt to cause bodily injury, sexual assault, to place a person in reasonable apprehension of imminent serious bodily injury to that person or to another, or to engage in any behavior that has been or could be stopped pursuant to a certain code section. And to make that a little simpler, that includes threatening, harassing, making annoying phone calls, destroying personal property, disturbing the peace of a qualifying person. And I'm going to go in just a minute as to what is a qualifying person for purposes of restraining orders in the court system. Last but not least, this code section indicates that abuse is not limited to the actual infliction of physical injury or assault. And I want to go back and really talk about that here in a minute. But for purposes of domestic violence restraining orders in the court, let me just for a moment talk about how a qualifying person is a current or a former spouse, someone you've been in a dating relationship with, a fiance, or a cohabitant. Also, you could have a child together. There are people that say they have children together and have never dated. The child of a party or relatives within the second degree of consanguinity. I could do a whole thing on the second degree of consanguinity, but basically your daughters and your grandparents count, but your great uncle's nephew does not. What doesn't qualify for a domestic violence restraining orders are neighbor disputes, business disputes, or criminal threats if that person is not somehow otherwise fall into those qualifying persons. So that's it. That's what we have in court to define what abuse is. But the reason I wanted to go through some of this other things that we talk about is twofold. Number one, some people that are in the middle of a domestic violence relationship don't even recognize it as domestic violence because they don't see the things. So many people talk about the hitting and the beating, and I'm not saying that's not part of it and it's not a big part of it, but there are so many things that other things that qualify for domestic violence that I think it's really important that you see. Also, like I said, if you're advocating for somebody to be helping them fill out a restraining order, behaviors that they may think don't qualify as domestic violence could be very important to the judge looking at that restraining order request. So, domestic violence can take many different forms, but the goal is always the same, and that is batterers seek to control the people they love and live with through fear. They do this by threatening, intimidating, or abusing them psychologically, physically, sexually, or economically. So again, we talk about it's not just hitting. One of the things that Sherry and I have had a million conversations about in the court is really looking at relationships and looking at behaviors and trying to figure out whether there's domestic violence, because sometimes you have hitting that's not actually domestic violence. So we're looking really at the power and control issues. And it's not just about the hitting. It's not just about anger. In fact, advocates have told me many times over the years that batterers control their anger the best. They use their anger to control and manipulate. It's not just like, oh, I flew off the handle and I need to learn to count to 10. That's not it. They purposefully use all of these behaviors to try to control and manipulate to gain power in that relationship. So I want to talk, and just in saying that, and I know that Ellen is going to talk much more about this, many communities, and I know she's going to talk about domestic violence in the Jewish community. If you listen to, I haven't listened to what Ellen's going to say, but I'm going to guess that a lot of what she talks about are ways that specifically in the Jewish community, they use things to control the other person. And you'll find that in a LGBTQ relationship, they may threaten to out the other person. Anything within that community that helps you control that other person's behavior, that's what you're going to see. And I'm going to assume that Ellen's going to talk a little bit more about that, or a lot more about that. So we do talk about physical abuse, hitting, slapping, kicking, hair pulling, pushing, punching, spitting on, and beating, all your typical physical things. I think we all sort of have a handle on that is part of the domestic violence. But there's a lot of verbal abuse as well. Constant criticism, humiliating remarks, mocking, name calling, yelling, swearing, interrupting, changing the subject. Now, I know I've had multiple discussions with people that say, oh, so everybody who interrupts is abusing? No. What we look at is a pattern of behavior here. So we're not looking at one thing, oh, if you interrupt the other person, then you're in that kind of relationship. No. But in looking at all of these things, you start to see a pattern. So there's psychological and emotional abuse, such as not expressing your feelings, not responding to or respecting the victim's feelings, rights, opinions, not taking the victim's concerns seriously, minimizing or denying the abuse is a big one. Blaming the victim for causing the abuse. We hear that all the time with, well, if she just had my dinner on time. And I tend to I apologize, a lot of he and she. I am fully aware that domestic violence knows no bounds. And there is domestic violence where the woman is the abuser and the man is the victim and vice versa. But if you study the numbers, the majority of it is the male in that relationship. And so I apologize that I used the he and she. You have sexual abuse, forcing sex on an unwilling partner, demanding sexual acts that the victim does not want to perform, including with other people, forcing the victim to have sex in front of the children, degrading treatment, refusing to have sex with the victim entirely, having affairs, therefore putting the victim at risk of STDs and HIV, not allowing the victim to use birth control, thus resulting in many unwanted pregnancies, taking sexually explicit photographs of the victim and posting or threatening to post those publicly. We're seeing more and more of that, I think, coming up. Isolation, making it hard for the victim to see their friends and relatives, monitoring their phone calls, reading mail, controlling where the victim goes, taking the victim's keys. Isolation, again, does not fit into the hitting, but it's huge in many domestic violence relationships. Coercion, such as making the victim feel guilty, pushing the victim into decisions, sulking, threatening harm if the victim does not comply, manipulating children and other family members, always insisting on being right and making up impossible rules, and then punishing the victim for breaking them. Harassment, stalking, keeping under surveillance, embarrassing the victim in public, constantly checking up on the victim, refusing to leave when asked, going into somebody's work and refusing to leave when they're on duty, etc. All falls into harassment. Economic abuse, not paying the bills, refusing to give the victim money, ruining the victim's credit by placing the family in debt, not letting the victim work, interfering with the victim's job, refusing to work and support the family. Abusing trust, again, something we look as an entire pattern, lying, breaking promises, withholding important information. One in here that I find I see a lot, and that's being overly jealous. And we'll talk about that here in a minute. It's one of the things on Jacqueline Campbell's lethality assessment is the jealousy. I've had cases where the person comes in and says, I don't know, but every time I come home, he sniffs me to see if I smell like another man. And that, for me, is huge red flags. Threats and intimidation, such as threatening to harm the victim, the children, family members, and pets, using their physical size to intimidate, shouting, keeping weapons, threatening to use them. It also includes threatening that if you threatening to report the victim to the immigration authorities, and other threats intended to induce compliance. Again, back to control. Destruction of property, such as destroying furniture, punching walls, throwing things, breaking dishes, destroying the computers, cutting up the victim's clothing, destroying objects which are significantly sentimental. It can also include destruction of important documents, such as green cards, driver's license, or other important documents. And finally, self-destructive behavior, such as abusing drugs or alcohol, threatening self-harm or suicide, driving recklessly with the victim in the car. Again, I've seen so many of these in the different relationships. PhD Jacqueline Campbell did a lethality assessment where she goes through, and there's a number of questions in here that she asks in deciding how dangerous a situation is. I think that they're telling in regards to what's domestic violence. I think they're equally telling in regards to just how dangerous a situation is the victim in. And again, it's it's 1 through 19. I'm not going to go through every one, but it's the numbers versus necessarily just one. But it's, has the physical violence increased in severity or frequency over the past year? Has he ever used a weapon against you or threatened you with a weapon? Does he ever try to choke you? Choking is a lethality one, and it is huge. Some people, when I've asked, did he choke you? They say no. I've learned to ask the question differently. When the question is, has he ever placed his hands around your throat? You get a different answer, because for some people, choking is like, well, I didn't pass out, therefore I wasn't choked. But the hands around the neck is huge in lethality. It's a big indicator to me of domestic violence. Does he own a gun? Has he ever forced you to have sex when you did not wish to? Does he use drugs? Does he threaten to kill you, or do you believe he's capable of killing you? Is he drunk every day or almost every day? Does he control most of all of your daily activities? For instance, does he tell you who you can be friends with, when you can see your family, how much money you can use, or when you can take the car? Have you ever been beaten while you're pregnant? One would think that domestic violence would go down during pregnancy. Physical abuse often goes up. Is he violent or constantly jealous of you? Has he threatened or tried to commit suicide? Does he threaten to harm your children? Does he follow or spy on you, leaving threatening notes, destroying your property, or calling you when you don't want him to? So these are all the things that I look at when I'm looking at whether there's domestic violence. So I want to talk for a minute now about the different kinds of restraining orders that there are and how you go about getting them. The first one is called an EPO. It's called an Emergency Protective Order. Most often this is given when a police officer goes out to a scene with allegations of domestic violence. They can call the judge that's on call, go over the facts of the case, and get for that victim, if they qualify, a protective order that is good for either 5 court days or 7 calendar days. And what the court has to look for is whether they have reasonable cause to believe there is immediate and present danger of specified acts, and the restraining order is necessary to prevent specified harm. And you can get stay away orders, you can get move out orders, you can get some custody orders, all good for a very short time to allow that person to go into court and get a restraining order. The next kind is a temporary restraining order. That's where you go in often after you've had the emergency protective order. That is good for 21 days or 25 with good cause. And again, reasonable proof of past acts of domestic abuse to prevent the abuse and enable the resolution of cases. Both the emergency protective order and the temporary restraining order are what we call ex parte orders. That means that you can get those orders without ever hearing from the other party. They're all temporary orders. They'll then give you a date for a hearing. That hearing has to be noticed to the person that you're seeking the restraining order, you being the protected party, them be the restrained party. And then you can both come in and tell your stories. That can be good for up to 5 years. You have to have reasonable proof of past acts of domestic violence, and it is to prevent abuse and enable the resolution of cases. You can get extensions. There's another 5-year extension that you can get. And so I just wanted to give you that because those are what you can get. The things that we talked about before are some of the things you're going to want to talk about or in those requests for restraining orders in determining and helping the court to determine whether to grant one. The last thing that I wanted to talk about is a support person. The family code actually allows a support person to come into court and be a support for the person. I know Sherry a couple of years ago called me and said, I'm finding out they're not allowing people in. I'm like, well, Family Code Section 6303 absolutely allows it. It talks about the function of the support person to provide moral and emotional support to the victim. There's no certification, there's no training, there's no any special qualifications required. But the support person is not present as a legal advisor and shall not give legal advice. And if you do those things, the judge can kick you out. You're there to support the person, make them feel not threatened. That support person shall be permitted to accompany either party to the proceedings to obtain a protective order. And where that party is not represented by an attorney, which is often the case, the support person can actually sit at counsel table with them and be supportive. If the court has issued a protective order, it says the support person, again, shall be permitted to accompany the party to any mediation, etc., whether that mediation is together with the other person or separate. And finally, like I said, it does not preclude the court from kicking somebody out if they're trying to act as an attorney or they're being disruptive. So you have to be respectful of the court, etc. But a support person is absolutely allowed in by law. So I think that's a little bit of the legal framework, and I'm happy to take questions at the end.
Hello, everyone. I will be talking to you this evening about domestic violence, the power and control dynamic, which Judge Lewis was just speaking about a little bit, as well as some of the ways in which we can identify for folks who maybe we know that are in a domestic violence relationship. So let me share my screen. All right. Bear with me, technical difficulties are running amok this evening. But I first want to start off by acknowledging this cycle of violence. There's this kind of idea when we talk about domestic violence that we really hear this heavy focus on this idea that there is a cycle, there's a pattern, and therefore we can kind of see what's going to happen in a relationship where domestic violence or intimate partner violence may be occurring. And in that, it can be really overwhelming. I don't know if many of you or if any of you have ever kind of looked or attempted to kind of search the web for anything about cycle of violence, but that information can be really overwhelming. The cycle of violence, if you were to search in social media sites or the internet, there is a vast majority of information, and it kind of varies in the amount that we see. There are 6 phases, or there's 4 phases, or there's 3 phases, and there's a variety of information, and it really depends on who you're talking to. Some of these folks have been gathering information for decades at this point, and every single person is kind of approaching it from a different perspective. So the cycle of violence, the idea of it kind of became around the 1970s, and it's still really being used a lot today. The idea is that there's this discernible pattern or phase that can help us understand what's happening in a relationship at any given time. And that kind of number of phase, like I mentioned, it really varies depending on research. There's constantly ever-changing amounts of research. This subject, unfortunately, is not going away. It is something that we are still experiencing today. We have even seen how a pandemic impacts domestic violence and the ways in which it is reported or handled within our different systems, whether it's legal systems or even just the amounts of calls that folks are having to make to hotlines or their local law enforcement in order to kind of get the support that they need. So with that, the information that you can find, it really paints a picture that abuse is occurring or happening in a way that is the same and that it's predictable throughout a relationship. However, like our approach with JFCS at the Jewish Family and Children's Service tends to look at a bigger focus, which is the power and control dynamic. So I refer to the cycle of violence and patterns pretty interchangeably throughout this, so please bear with me. The most common in terms of the cycle of violence or patterns of violence tends to have about 4 different phases or 3 different phases, depending. The one that I have on the screen is, it has a honeymoon phase where everything is good. There's nothing really happening. We're kind of we're in the good part of a relationship. Maybe it's brand new. Maybe it is just kind of we're settling in. There's no abuse that's taking place, and it's kind of just solid. Then there's a tension building phase, and that's where some minor incidents are maybe occurring, some things that maybe are red flags to us in relationships, things that we're not necessarily excited about happening, but maybe they're not setting off a warning bell for us. Then there's an explosive phase, which typically involves abuse, like some sort of physical abuse. However, that is not the case in all regards. And then there's a reconciliation phase, which is similar to the honeymoon phase. So in some cycles, you're going to see those two kind of combining to be together, that the honeymoon and reconciliation concept are together. So with the pattern of abuse or the cycle of abuse, we understand that not all relationships are the same. There is a pattern that happens in relationships where domestic violence is present. However, the violence that the person faces rarely happens in a predictable manner. This is something that we talk about often with our work with survivors, in that this idea that we can predict when something is about to happen can really feel overwhelming for a lot of our survivors, simply because it kind of puts the focus on them, and it changes the conversation, as opposed to, well, what can we do to support you? In some areas, it feels as if it's a conversation of, well, why didn't you leave during the honeymoon phase? Or why didn't you leave during after the tension was building? And so for that, we try and kind of change the topic, or change the conversation, change the way in which we view how patterns of abuse are happening. As I mentioned, every relationship is completely different. And that means the dynamics that play out are going to vary in each relationship. This is not a simple, oh, we got mad at each other, we were having a bad day, and we yelled a lot, or we cursed at each other, or we nitpicked at each other. It goes beyond that. Some abusers will go through the cycle more rapidly than others, while others happen over greater lengths of period of time. Over time, the pattern does begin again, starting kind of at this honeymoon phase, and it shortens to at one point to where potentially the honeymoon phase is no longer happening. We're constantly just going from tension building to the explosion portion, tension building, explosion portion. And again, in those pieces, it looks different for everyone. In the honeymoon phase beginning, maybe things are good. It's the beginning of the relationship, so no one's needing to beg for forgiveness. There's no promises that are needing to be made, but maybe it's just a really positive kind of experience in the relationship. But then over time, some tension is building, and maybe there's some moodiness that's happening, some nitpicking, withdrawing of affection, putting down, yelling. Maybe there's some drinking or drugs that are happening. Threats are starting to occur, perhaps. Destruction of property, criticizing. Maybe there's some sullenness, or some like they're withdrawn completely. Maybe there's some accusations of someone being crazy. So that's examples of like gaslighting. And then the explosion again varies. Sometimes there's hitting, there's choking. Sometimes it involves humiliation, imprisonment. It could involve sexual assault, the use of weapons, beating, verbal abuse, again, more destruction of property. And all of these kind of vary. There's not one specific way that we can paint this picture. Over time, we can recognize a pattern. As humans, that's what we are meant to do. We are able to recognize patterns. It's how we learn. It's how we kind of grow to understand what our norm is. However, it's the patterns that are constantly happening that are ending in this kind of abusive predicament. As research continues, we are continuing our understanding of how domestic violence is perpetrated. And the one thing that continues to show is that these actions are able to happen due to power and control, where one partner has more power and control over another partner. So the power and control wheel was created by the Domestic Abuse Intervention Project in Duluth, Minnesota, in 1987. The wheel really shows the behaviors or tactics used by perpetrators to keep their partners in the relationship. Some of the behaviors used to gain and maintain power and control over the victim or survivor really range from being covert and being overt in their display. One thing I like to point out about the power and control wheel is that some of these behaviors can actually be seen in non-abusive relationships. But the difference is that there's not a violent aspect. So for instance, if someone is saying that they are denying or blaming or minimizing how we're feeling in a non-abusive relationship, we may be able to sit down and have a conversation with our partner and acknowledge the pieces that are bothering us, or acknowledge the pieces about the gender roles that are happening, or the pieces about not feeling equal in our relationship. The difference here is that there is a use of physical or sexual violence that really changes the game. It doesn't make it the same. We also acknowledge in our work at JFCS that even if a client is actively not in the relationship where abuse was occurring, it doesn't mean that the power and control that the partner had over them is gone. For many, the ties to the relationship go far beyond simply just getting out of the relationship or leaving. Children, pets, lack of resources, disabilities, immigration status, love, shame, intimidation, cultural or religious context, as well as fear, can all be reasons that someone is still impacted by domestic violence. So just because you're no longer in a relationship, it does not mean that the power and control dynamic isn't still possibly at play for folks. So there are some warning signs that we share with our clients. And one thing we like to acknowledge, as I've done this entire process, is that every relationship does look different. And some of these warning signs really might not capture the full spectrum of what abuse looks like. However, some of these may be red flags. Some of them may be in tandem when maybe one or two of them aren't such a big deal, but if you combine them, it starts to become worrisome. So their partner maybe insults them in front of other people. Maybe they're constantly worried about making their partner angry, or they make excuses for their partner's behavior. Their partner is extremely jealous or possessive. They may have unexplained marks or injuries. They've maybe stopped spending time with friends and family, or maybe they're depressed or anxious, and you notice changes in their personality. All of these could be warning signs. It does not mean for sure that they are in a domestic violence relationship. However, they could be something to pay attention to. So in that event, how do you help? Seeing somebody that we care about experiencing domestic violence can really be difficult, and it's natural to want to try and help in any way that you can, whether that's contacting law enforcement, trying to forcefully remove them out of the situation, kind of whatever that looks like. There's some things you might want to consider, and that is leaving an abusive relationship is the most dangerous time, as the abuser may feel that their power is slipping, they're losing it. They will potentially do anything they can to maintain that power, and therefore it may not be safe for the person who's trying to get out of the relationship. Just because someone is able to leave an abusive relationship, it does not mean that they're free from abuse, like I mentioned earlier. Leaving typically requires a really detailed plan and long-term supports. It's not just a matter of we'll get out of this and get into a shelter, because many shelters, unfortunately, are booked. They are full, especially during COVID. We noticed that a lot in terms of our referrals for our clients at JFCS. And the victims typically know that know their situation the best, and may know of real threats that could be missed by outsiders. And therefore, that leads to the lethality or the potential of how dangerous the situation may be. So some ways that you could support someone who is experiencing a domestic violence situation is simply to listen to them. Sometimes it is very scary and overwhelming. And we try to offer a non-judgmental space, encourage them to make a safety plan, keep checking in, be social, connect with them, and offer them supports, because remembering you can't always rescue them. Sometimes there are situations that don't allow them to be rescued, or perhaps they choose to return to the relationship. So those types of things are really helpful to kind of keep in mind and be having in the back of your mind. And lastly, I just want to leave you with some of the resources for support and for more information. Some of them are local to us, and some of them are the national leaders in this information.
Thank you. And next up is Ellen.
And it's interesting to come next because I used to do that job that Deirdre's doing. So I'm going to put it within a Jewish context, which is a little bit different because Jews have a different response to this than other communities do. I've done this work for over 40 years now, and I have abuse survivors in my practice, and they range from those who, one woman was abused by a rabbi for a period of time, and I have others who have been abused by parents and siblings, and some who have been abused by partners and spouses. They all come from different backgrounds. Some came from a religious background and some did not. Let me go into the specifics of a few cases. And by the way, you should know that my study that was done in 1978-79 was financed by National Council. And the woman I'm talking about now, and she's very open about her abuse circumstance, she helped underwrite the study. And she herself grew up in an abusive home, which she described as hitting and shoving and throwing dishes and such. So when she came into her own home, her husband, who was a very good provider, this is a wealthy home, her husband she didn't identify the abuse. She saw what was happening as control, but she didn't define it as abusive until she was in her 70s and he took his cane and slammed his cane against her. That she identified as abuse, and she was out of there. And I think she was incredibly brave to then openly talk about her circumstance within the community. One of the saddest cases I ever had was when I was working on an inpatient unit at St. Jude Hospital in Fullerton, and I had a woman who was there who was in her 30s, maybe early 40s, and she came from an Orthodox home. She went to shul with her father every Saturday, and every Saturday following services, she came home and he raped her. And that went on for years and years and years. When she came into the hospital, I did her intake, and I asked her, did you grow up with any abuse? And she said, no. So then I asked her in a different way, because I knew by how she was presenting that she had a history of something that she was trying to hide. And so I asked her about any inappropriate touching, inappropriate speech, inappropriate pushing, shoving, any of that. And she finally said to me, I don't know why you're asking me those questions, but yes, I used to go to synagogue with my father every week, and we would come home and he would have sex with me. And it went on for years. Needless to say, she left Judaism altogether. And the abuse occurred on the East Coast, and this was on the West Coast. So she left home, and she was unfortunately highly suicidal. And I told the staff to not let her leave while I was not there over the weekend, because she would not talk to anybody else, because there wasn't any other Jewish person who would understand her particular circumstance. And unfortunately, they discharged her, and she went to the nearest freeway and jumped. That was the saddest case I've ever had, and the most moving, and imprinted in me forever. There was another case in Long Beach of multiple forms of abuse, of a father against his wife and children. Primarily, it was a child. And this particular child was picked on because they could be more outspoken. And this parent didn't like this child being so outspoken. And so at one point, the abuse became such that it was actually grandparents who contacted me. And they told me that this parent had thrown the child in the bathroom and he hit the sink and broken a tooth and a few other parts of his face. And so the family got counseling, though I have to tell you, in this particular case, the parent who was the abuser came after me. And I had to be escorted in and out of the JCC for quite a while because he made threats. So it can have some risk being the reporter. So the study that everybody is referring to was done in it was published in 1980. It was done in 78 and 79. And it was my master's thesis along with my partner, Betsy. We went to 3 Orthodox, 3 conservative, and 3 Reform congregations in the greater Los Angeles area. And I mean greater. We went from far north to far south. And we had to ask very specific questions to get information, because if we had said to people, so have you ever been used? They all would have said no. Everybody had a questionnaire to complete. And from those 209 questionnaires, we had 22 incidents of spousal abuse, 4 incidents of sexual abuse, 11 incidents of forced social isolation, and 118 incidents of violent acts towards children. That was the one that shocked us. And by the way, forced social isolation was considered a form of abuse, clearly, in 1980. Some of the terms have changed. These were all heterosexual couples. Today, it would be much more open to everybody. But at that point, we had to convince the school that it was okay to do this study, because they were too scared to have us do it for fear of the response of the community. And you have to remember, this was still within a period of time after World War II that Jews were being picked on. So they were scared. So we showed that it was possible that we could do the study. The types of violent acts included battering, burning, shooting, knifing, and sexual assault. Hitting and slapping were considered abusive if a red mark remained on the body for more than 10 minutes. Forced social isolation is the excessive isolation of a person from his or her family and friends. And we see that frequently in the Jewish community. There is a sense of isolation. We had a case in another city where we lived where there was a woman who was very involved in the synagogue until she started to drop out. And I turned to my husband and I said, I think we need to check on her because I fear that something's going on. Well, we did check on her, and I was correct. There was something going on, which she denied. She ended up in the hospital because she was so severely hurt. The Los Angeles study did reveal some differences compared to other communities. One difference is the frequency of abuse correlated with income and mobility. In other words, we had a higher incidence of abuse in higher income families. When I posed that to a synagogue group of kids years ago, I was surprised how they responded because they said, well, of course it's true. If you're in a bigger house, you can hide more. They showed very good insight. Family violence has been shown to be a transmitted phenomenon. So we know that child abusers were often abused children. Wife batterers were often both abused children and witnesses to the battering within their own families. Jews, like non-Jews, transmit family violence from generation to generation. And it's interesting because people have come up to me various times while living here in Long Beach, which is over 30 years, and pulled me aside and said, you know, I want to check with you about something. This is what happened in my family growing up. Would you consider that to be abusive? And I said, well, what's the long-term effect on you? And that's how they determined that it was abuse. We asked them, by the way, who they would go to for help. No one went to the police. Very few went to a rabbi or a cantor. Most went to a friend or a therapist. And I think that's still true today. Jews in general don't reveal themselves to the police. So we also looked, oh, this was an interesting question. We also asked them the occurrence of domestic violence in the general community versus the Jewish community. And this was very telling. 62% of those we surveyed felt that family violence was a problem in the general community, while 61% believed it was not a problem in the Jewish community. And that continues, I think, to this day. So there are also historical perspectives regarding Jewish domestic violence because it's been written in legal text for hundreds of years. Rabbi Meir of Rosenberg, who lived during the 13th century, wrote that if a man refuses to stop beating his wife, he must remove the causes of such quarrels, if possible, or divorce her and pay her the ketubah. This, by the way, becomes a power issue in some Jewish abusive relationships, whether the man will pay the ketubah, the get, grant the get. In a lot of cases, they don't. And then it becomes possible for the community to post in community papers and on walls that this man is a bad man and you don't do business with him. And I will happily answer other questions later.
Okay, thank you, Ellen. And Julie.
Hi, I am Julie Schwartz, and thank you so much for letting me come here and speak. I have to say, Jackie, or Ms. Lewis, that I would say the majority of your description of domestic violence was so triggering for me that, you know, when it's clear for a lot of us. And I think what, you know, a lot of people say, well, how do you end up in a domestic violence relationship? And I'd say with every, you know, when people ask you that, the problem is you don't wake up and say, you know what, I'm going to go into a domestic violence relationship. It doesn't. It sneaks up on you. It really does. And that circle of violence, you know, that Deidre was talking about is a very big factor in that creation of, I don't know, you being in this relationship. And, you know, I had, an abusive relationship for a few years. This was the father of my daughters. And I experienced probably almost all of what you've described, Jackie, in this relationship, you know, with with my two daughters. And, you know, I think that the reason that I really wanted to talk about this is that shame is actually a very heavy part of domestic violence. Even to the point, you know, where you're saying you have to change your question in order to get the answer, because even saying, have you been choked? No, because admitting it to ourselves is one thing, admitting it to other people is probably just as terrifying. So I think that shame is a big variable in how we end up leaving, because I think that we get trapped in these relationships because we think you wake up and you say, there's no way this is my life. This can't be possible. You know, how have I managed to, end up this way? And I think that's a lot of what holds people, or I'll say women, because that's who I work with mainly. That's what holds a lot of women back from not only admitting to abusive relationships, just even getting out of them. So when I started my nonprofit specifically to help women who are realizing that they are in these relationships. And, there's a lot involved in getting out of a relationship. Anyway, but getting out of an abusive relationship for me had been one of the hardest things that I've ever had to do. And I think that the best way to describe it, when you confide to other people, I'm in an abusive relationship. Unfortunately, the first thing you're told is you should leave, right now. Well, that's not really tangible for a lot of women. For any of us, if I said to any of you, pack up and leave, you got to go now. There's nothing that feels more insurmountable than being in a domestic violence relationship. Honestly, it feels so heavy because you realize there's so much you have to give up in order to just get out. So that's how I came to the realization that I really wanted to help more people, because I know from my experience that I couldn't just leave. I had two kids. Both were toddlers. They were, 5 and no, younger than that. They were 3 and 6 months. So it was just really, I had all these other things to care about, as well as getting out of this relationship. So for me, I was not the primary breadwinner, which is also, economic abuse is very common. If they hold on to the purse strings, I knew someone who actually, she was the breadwinner, but her partner knew when she was getting paid. So he would check and make sure that she had her paycheck. And then he'd already had it earmarked for whatever it is he wanted to do. And in fact, he owned their house, but he told her that she had to pay him rent because he was watching the baby all day. So that was how he decided that he was really the one who was owed this money. So that's a pretty common situation that I see. So when I talk about, when people say, so the response to people when you say I'm in an abusive relationship is you should just leave or call the domestic violence hotline. But I think that's a hard one too, because people assume that all your answers are there at the other end of that domestic violence hotline, and that's not the case, unfortunately. It's not a concierge service for DV, which is, so people say once you call them, your problem's over. Everything's done. But that's not the case at all. I would say every time that I've called, that I know people that have called, in fact, you get, you're transferred to a women's shelter in your area that may or may not have a bed. So you have to say, okay, is this dire enough for me right now that I need to pack up and go to a women's shelter? And I'd say a lot of times people will say, oh gosh, my situation isn't that bad. So there are all these.
Julie, we lost your sound.
We just lost your sound, Julie.
Julie,
We can't hear you.
can she not hear us?
But it's the next part. It's the getting out. That's the hardest part.
We lost your sound for a minute there.
Oh no. Okay.
Yeah,
Where did we lose me?
Back now.
Okay. Which part where did you hear me last?
That someone has to go through the analysis in their head of whether they
Sorry.
go to a women's shelter.
Right. And shelters are hard, very hard. When you go to a shelter, traditionally what they want you to do, quit your job, change your phone number, disappear for 3 months, 90 days. You got to pull your kids out of their schools, cut off all contact from anyone in your life, which, being that we are so spoon-fed with social media, that feels really difficult. But if you're working a job, if you're trying to get somewhere, if you're trying to get out of this relationship, quitting your job seems like the last thing you can do. Also with shelters, if you have boys over the age of 12, they are not allowed to be in the shelter with you. So sometimes there's that choice of, do I stay and protect my kids? Do I leave and just take the one? Or, so there are a lot of different major choices that have to happen with leaving this relationship. And I think that was just, there were so many different things that have to click to put this in motion. And you had addressed something about behavior we don't realize are abuse because we're so immune to it. I had a client the other day who was complaining that her ex, she had a lawyer, he had a lawyer, and her ex kept emailing her to complain about what was going on, and couldn't she just accept this, this divorce proceedings, and couldn't she just take what he was offering? And I said, you got to tell your lawyer to tell him to stop, because that is absolutely abuse. He's trying to control you by circumventing your lawyer and his lawyer in order to get what he wants still. And she didn't even realize that. She just thought it was annoying. So I know that we sometimes don't see what is as difficult. We don't see abuse because we're used to it, with Ellen telling about, that circle of violence or the family thing. If it feels normal, why would I report it? Why would I change it? Why would there be something different to look for? So recognizing patterns, recognize this, that, and the other thing, a lot of that has to happen slowly. And, I got out of my abusive relationship and I started helping other women get out of theirs because I really felt that there had to be a support that wasn't stay or go into a shelter. Those were the two options that almost always are given to us. So for me, I know that it's starting over, literally starting over from, I actually ended up I couldn't pay rent and feed my kids. So I ended up not paying rent. I got evicted and I was homeless for a while because this was all happened so quickly. I was lucky enough to have my ex was actually arrested and removed from our home. And I had one policeman who said, I got to tell you, it never gets better. It never gets easier. And that was, I would say that was the first time I heard that really it's time to be done with this. And there are situations where women don't get told that by the police, or they're not encouraged as much, which is hard too. There's not really, how do I say this? There might be training, but a lot of times we get jaded going out there anyway. So if you see this and you're saying, why would you put up with it again? Unfortunately, we don't know. That's the truth. I don't know why I put up with it for so long, So what I did was create this project Woman Good because I really wanted almost a third choice. So what my idea has been is that we want to get an exit plan, which is just a way to kind of slowly extricate yourself. Sometimes you have to just go. And sometimes you might even have a little bit of leeway, which is where this particular project that I have comes in. So what I wanted to do is offer space for women to start setting aside their belongings, their social security card, their birth certificates, all that passports, all that stuff that can be destroyed, that can be held, and that you need in order to start again, in order to get an apartment, in order to get a car, in order to get a lease, anything. You need these things, but you don't realize that when you're like, I got to get out of this. I don't know what to do. So important papers, cash, gift cards. A lot of times I advise my clients to hide their cash in their feminine hygiene products, because a lot of times that's not, that's the one area of their life that they are not, that is left alone by their partner. But it's really figuring out ways to kind of get money out. Like when you go to the store and make purchases, you want to take a little cash out as you're making that purchase, so you have money and you're stocking it up. Kind of a lot of these things was information that I would say other survivors and I knew, but no one really shared it. So for me, this is the most important thing, is making sure that we're sharing this and getting that information out there and advocating for each other. So one of the hardest parts for me was actually filling out my paperwork in court and figuring out all the stuff that I had to do, because it's handed to you, and it's handed to you based on the assumption you know what you're doing. And I have to tell you, I had no idea what I was doing, and so they say, okay, here you go. All right, well, what do I do? Well, you fill it out, you include your evidence, you got to come back with a triplicate, you got to turn it in, you got to wait for the judge, you got to do all this kind of stuff. I didn't know that, And so I remember I had to do something else. I came back. I had my restraining order approved, but I was sitting there. I had 2 girls. I didn't have a car up until 3 months ago. So I had a little red wagon that I would pull my daughters around in all the time. And, you got to sit. I didn't realize that you could go and come back. It's not, you're given very little information because they have a lot of people to deal with. And it had nothing to do with any of us. It's just, again, the assumption is we know what we're doing. I had no idea. So I have kids, I have diapers to change. I have one child with special needs I have to attend to. Sometimes, they run out. She's also an eloper, so I'm dealing with that, which is not uncommon for a lot of us. And another thing that I found out was that sometimes, this happened to me personally, and it happened to a couple other people, where they said their local police station had no idea that they had a restraining order out. So the police station, I was advised, bring a restraining order to the local police station. I didn't know that. I wasn't told that until I went to the police station and said, my ex is harassing me. What can I do? They're like, we don't know. Why would you ask us that? Because again, it's information that people assume we know, but very often it's hard. And it's hard to find it because there's that shame involved, and that shame involved with domestic violence. So it really puts a tamper on us finding information, on sharing information, and getting it out there. And it's, I have a BA from Simmons College, same with Ms. Deidre here, so I didn't know you were a Simmons alum until just now. And English is my first language. And this was a difficult endeavor, So my thought was, I can't even imagine if you don't have a degree, if you don't speak English well, if it's not your first language, if you have issues with handwriting, with any of these things, the first thing you're going to do is quit because it's hard. I'm not going to say, yeah, it was a breeze. I mean, it sucked. There are a few things. It's very hard. And you got to be on top of things. I was in court between children's court, family court, child support court. I was in court once a month for a year and a half. That was my third job, is just going to court and taking time off and getting there because I didn't have a car. So I had to take the bus anywhere, even over to Monterey Park where children's court is, So you have to be tough, and the problem is, for me, is that you just have to understand you have to keep going. And a lot of times people will say, oh, good, you're out. And then they stop checking in on you. And then they stop making sure you're okay. And they assume that you're fine. Or, I've had people give stipulations like, well, you can have this, this, and that, but not if you go back to your abuser, not if you do this. And I think that that's really, a lot of times we're given those ultimatums, not as something negative, but just as a way to, because people who are not in it understand that it's bad. People who are in it understand that it's bad. But we have to make a lot of really tough choices in order to get ourselves out. So I want to help as many people get out of these relationships and stay out of them, because they'll know what to do. They know where help is. I can, getting them in the right direction, or even just calling them and saying, hi, can I help? And I found that has been the best situation for a lot of my clients who have said, oh, I didn't even realize I knew any of this was available to me, which is where I get, being of service is one of the best feelings ever. So if I'm able to help other women not prolong this process or understand what's involved, then I think that returning back to that familiarity can be cut down a little bit. Even if, maybe I'm an optimist at heart, something like that. But I do know that by sharing my story, people have fessed up to me. I don't think there's anyone you will ever meet who does not have who has domestic violence hasn't affected their life. There's no one. It's everywhere. People say, oh, my sister, my aunt, my this, that, the other thing. Once you're open about what your situation is, that's when people will open up to you. And so that's how I have found, that's the best way for me to give back. So I think, am I time?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank
you so much for letting me.
Absolutely perfect ending. I don't know about you guys, but this was so much. I mean, I had my fingers crossed for this program, and it's 10 times what I expected. It's absolutely perfect, and I thank you all. It was so well done. We're going to go to questions and answers now. Deb's going to handle that.
I have a few questions. Yeah, I know it's getting a little bit late, but we just have a few questions.
Okay, I did want to say one particular thing before the questions and answers go, and that is to Julie. We're going to need to either clone you, or we're going to need to get what you do down on paper so that we can, your experience with the court. I was watching Jackie, and Jackie was watching me, and we were both watching Deidre.
I was watching both of you.
We all look like this. We all look like this. And so I'm going to talk to you privately offline, and we're going to see if we can put what you do in writing and get it out in a new format, because it's really, really important. And I'm going to turn it over to you now, Cynthia.
Okay. So the first question I have is an interesting one. We have mandated reporters for child abuse, including, for example, educators and healthcare providers. So what we're curious about is what would be the advantages and disadvantages of having mandated reporters for adult domestic abuse? I don't know who that should go to, but.
I think that might be dangerous. I would be a little concerned about somebody calling when the person's not out, when the person's in the home, but let my experts talk. But from
It's
the
a
bench, that would make me a
it's
little
a
uncomfortable.
provocative question. Yeah.
That would make me a little uncomfortable. Anybody else?
Yeah, so this question has been around for a very long time. And I remember participating in some panel discussion about getting medical people to report report abuse. Because when a woman or a man goes into a hospital or goes to the doctor and reveals what's going on with her body, that's the point at which some kind of report can go in.
Yeah, that's right.
And is that something that would be good or not so good?
I think it depends on the individual and how ready they are to acknowledge or do something about it. Because I think if they're not ready to do something about it, it can be hurtful.
And it's really hard to paint domestic violence with a really broad brush like that, right? Legally, we know what it looks like for elder adult abuse or dependent adult abuse or child abuse, right? Because they are populations that are protected, right? We know that they have specific guidelines and stipulations, but as adults, it feels like it gets a little murky in terms of if they are not a part of a protected class.
Okay, the next question is, when an abused person takes action to get a protective order, how often does this cause the abuser to increase their violent responses?
I can take this one.
Yeah. I'm gonna let Julie talk. But we have seen in the courtroom that play out right in front of us. If you're going to get a restraining order, you need a plan B. You cannot get a restraining order unless you have assistance to keep the violator away. And that means, just the idea of Julie saying, you know what, I didn't know to even take the restraining order to the local police department. We're supposed to say that from the bench. We do. I don't know that everybody does. No, Julie's saying they don't. But that's one of the things that they are supposed to do, is to tell you where to take it. So they will re-abuse any way they can. Bring you back to court 700 times. Sit in front of your house 101 feet away. Stand outside the school 101 feet away. So yeah, getting a restraining order can be a dangerous business.
I was going to say too that I think that two things. That number one, that's why they say one of the most dangerous times is when you're leaving, and often restraining orders go with leaving. Secondly, there is a quote notice requirement when you seek an emergency protective order, but even the law has built in that you can get by without giving notice of that order by saying, I was afraid he'd abuse me if I told him I was seeking it. Mm-hmm. So it's even built into the law, the concept of we can then grant it, then they get the restraining order, hopefully the police help him get him out or whatever, and then they're a little bit more protected. But it's a scary time from what I can understand, and that's even built into the notice requirements of the law.
I found personally with my situation is that, my ex is not as savvy, but there was situations where he'd show up at my house. He would kind of hassle my friends on Facebook, things like that. So what I had to do is report it every time and call the police, the non-emergency line. I get a report, a lot of times you get cops who are like, are you serious? I'm like, I know this is a pain, but I need to fill this out right now because I need to establish that he has a history of violating this order, because that's how I've been able to prove again and again, that what he's doing, he knows perfectly well what's on the order. He has it. He's been served it. So for me, that has been the best ammo in order to show his lawyer, show the judge, show my lawyer, this guy will not stop. And not to say that I'm unsafe, but I will say that has been the best way for me to continue to prove and have evidence, which sometimes can be hard to produce, but you have evidence saying, look, not only does this guy have a restraining order, he keeps violating it. So for me, that's been the best way to utilize that.
So this is a more general question. Have you seen patterns related to the ages of the abuser and the victim? Mostly younger people or older people or some combination? And has this changed during the pandemic?
No.
So you're all shaking your heads, meaning
yes.
all kinds of people.
All kinds of people, people you wouldn't expect. Domestic violence, unfortunately, does not know a race, an age, a gender, a status, a socioeconomic status, an education level. It doesn't know any of those things. Our clientele, the amount of people that we serve, it varies. No one person is the face of domestic violence, unfortunately. So I would not say at all that there is a specific age range or anything. Now, of course, right, if we're talking about older adults, that changes a little bit. The narrative, it does change, but I mean, anyone could be a victim of domestic violence.
And you didn't see any real changes during the pandemic in terms of who was being affected?
No. In fact, I feel like
it's just that it went up. Yeah,
it did. It went up. The amount of folks that were reaching out to us increased. In some instances, there was a decrease in some places because at first there was this initiative that everyone's safe at home. However, they had to quickly recant that because not everyone is actually safe at home. So it kind of has varied throughout, but I would say that it's been pretty consistent, which is rather unfortunate because, like I mentioned, this is not something that's going away, and it's only increasing. The ways in which people can perpetrate the abuse, the stalking, the use of social media, all of those things, right. It's not leaving, unfortunately. So it just adds other layers to the situation.
So then we have a question for you, Ellen. A South Orange County synagogue posts information about domestic violence in the women's bathroom stalls, and the questioner was impressed by the information provided. Do you think that congregations should provide this kind of information, and how should it be disseminated without an issue such as, oh, the kids would see it and it would harm them? What are your feelings about that?
Well, first of all, lots of synagogues have done that, and it has not harmed children at all. I don't think kids are going to suddenly identify as being in an abused family if they see this material. On the other hand, children who are in an abusive family may step forward and say, there's stuff going on that I don't understand and I need some help with. Mm-hmm. So I think it's the right place to have the material.
Okay. If anybody else has a question, please put it in the chat addressed to me. But I think we're getting close to wrap-up time.
I have a question.
Who said that?
Andrea, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
I'm wondering, are there any domestic violence courts down in Southern California anywhere?
Yes.
And are they
yes,
set
of course.
separately?
Yes,
okay.
There are domestic violence courts. Jackie.
There are domestic violence courts. They're fewer and fewer. Most of them are handled in your family law courts that do a lot of domestic violence. In my courthouse, I do a lot of the criminal domestic violence. There's been moves over the years back and forth, whether having courts that are singularly do just that, helpful or not helpful. I have found that oftentimes having somebody on the bench that knows a lot about it is liked by some and disliked by others. So it makes it difficult, because oftentimes batters don't want to be called on the things that they do and how they do it. And so they manage to get out of those courtrooms. So it goes back and forth, but there are a few.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I wanted to say thanks again to all of our speakers this evening. I think that we've all learned a lot of information. It's a difficult subject, but we need to hear about it. And I also wanted to thank Deb Lelchek, who's been behind the scenes, running the tech, spotlighting everybody at the right time, and getting through whatever tech problems we had. And Deb is the other co-vice president of advocacy. So before you all, and a hand for our speakers, yes. And before you all run out of the room, I'd like to share some information about some exciting upcoming programs that we have coming up. So actually tomorrow evening, as a follow-up in a way to this program, we're going to have our movie club discussion. And the movie that's going to be discussed is about the music legend Tina Turner, who was herself a victim of domestic violence, as you probably know. So that's coming up tomorrow evening, 7 o'clock on Zoom. Then on Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday, October 31st to November 2nd, we are partnering in a coat drive for coats to be dropped off at Temple Israel in Long Beach. You can get detailed information about all of this on our website. On Sunday, November 7th, at 2 p.m., we are collaborating with Temple Beth David Sisterhood in Bigno. So that should be a fun time. The women of Beth David and NCJW and all ages are welcome. And then on Sunday, November 14th, as a specific follow-up to this program, we will be supporting Julie's project Woman Good with a community service opportunity. And you'll be able to drive by the JCC and drop off your gently used clothing, used books, and other items for a shop that Julie owns at Long Beach Vintage. And last but not least, in January 24th, we're planning our annual book review. This year, our speaker will be a woman, Lucy Adlington, who will be discussing her book, The Dressmakers of Auschwitz. Like I said, more detailed information is on our website. So we are looking for volunteers to help both with the coat drive, October 31st, and with the Project Woman Good project on Sunday, November 14th. If you'd like to help, contact Andrea Frieden, and we put some information in the chat. You can call and leave a message or email her at communityservice@ncjwlongbeach.org. And that's it for this evening. Thank you again to our wonderful speakers and our very, very attentive audience. And stay safe and well.